A struggling mechanic risks his life to save a dog on a rainy highway. Unaware the dog's owner is a reclusive millionaire artist searching for something real in a world of false impressions. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The rain had started with a whisper, a soft tapping on the garage's tin roof, almost gentle in its arrival. Jake Lawson barely noticed. His hands were deep in the guts of a rusted-out pickup, fingers blackened with oil, mind focused on the steady rhythm of bolts and belts and the occasional hiss of steam. It was later than it should have been, but that wasn't new. The shop's old fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the concrete floor as thunder rumbled low in the distance. Jake exhaled through his nose, adjusting the wrench in his grip. The job wasn't complicated. Just another water pump in a long line of worn-out engines and patchwork repairs. People in this town couldn't afford fancy fixes. They needed their cars to last, and Jake, well, he'd always been the guy to make that happen. No flair, no fuss. Just honest work. He stood and stretched, muscles tight from hours hunched over hoods and undercarriages. The garage was quiet now, save for the rain picking up speed and the occasional creak of old pipes settling into the night. Jake grabbed a rag and wiped his hands, glancing toward the clock on the wall. Nearly 8:30. Emily would be asleep. By now Mrs. Pruitt, their neighbor, had probably fed her dinner and made sure she brushed her teeth. He'd have to thank her again tomorrow. Jake stepped out into the parking lot, letting the cool drizzle hit his face. There was something calming about the rain. How it softened the edges of the world, muffled the noise, made things feel slower, quieter. He pulled up his hood and moved toward his beat-up old sedan. Home wasn't far, but even that short drive felt longer when your body was tired and your heart ached from years of holding too much. Just as he reached for the door, a sharp bark cut through the rain. Jake turned. At the far end of the road, through the sheets of water and glare of streetlights, a blur of golden fur darted between two lanes of traffic. Tires screeched. A horn blared. Jake didn't think. He ran. The windshield wipers thumped rhythmically, struggling to keep up with the sheets of rain pounding the glass. Jake squinted through the storm, the world outside little more than a blur of smeared headlights and gray silhouettes. His old sedan groaned every time it hit a pothole, the engine rattling in protest. He knew he should have changed the spark plugs 2 weeks ago, but time and money had a way of slipping through his fingers lately. He wasn't even a mile from home, thinking about whether the leftover soup in the fridge would be enough for dinner tomorrow when something golden flashed across the beam of his headlights. Jake's foot slammed the brake pedal. The tires shrieked against the wet pavement. The car fishtailed slightly before grinding to a stop. His heart slammed into his ribs. And there dead center in the lana stood a soaked, trembling golden retriever, its fur plastered to its body, chest rising and falling in fast, panicked breaths. The dog turned its head, ears flat, eyes wide. Cars flew past in the opposite direction, splashing water like ocean spray. "Shit," Jake muttered, throwing the gear into park and bolting out into the rain without thinking. The cold hit him instantly. A wall of wind and water that soaked him to the skin in seconds. He didn't care. His boots splashed through puddles as he jogged toward the dog, arms slightly out like he was approaching a skittish deer. Hey there," he said gently, over the rush of wind. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The retriever backed up a step, its paws slipping on the wet asphalt. A car swerved nearby, horn blaring. Jake's stomach clenched. "Easy," he said again, slower now, dropping to one knee despite the freezing water. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the granola bar Emily had shoved in there that morning, just in case, and unwrapped it with steady hands. The dog hesitated, sniffed the air, then crept forward. Close enough that Jake could see the dirt around its collar, the scratches on its nose. "There you go," Jake whispered. In a single motion, he looped his arm around the dog's body and lifted it up. And for the first time that day, the rain didn't feel quite as heavy. Jake barely had the dog in his arms when the chaos erupted around him. A car rounded the bend too fast, its headlights blinding through the downpour. The driver hit the brakes, tires shrieking as the sedan hydroplaned just feet away, narrowly missing them. A horn blared long and furious. Another vehicle veered into the opposite lane to avoid the scene, splashing a tidal wave of icy water over Jake's back. Shouts echoed faintly from somewhere, muffled by the roar of the storm. Jake didn't flinch. He didn't have the luxury. He tightened his grip around the golden retriever, shielding its head with his forearm. The dog shivered against his chest, claws clutching at his jacket, heartbeat hammering wild and fast beneath its sodden fur. Jake ducked low and ran half blind, soaked through, legs burning toward the shoulder of the road where the tall grass met the asphalt. His boots slipped in the mud. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Couldn't fall. "Hang on, buddy," he muttered between ragged breaths, heart pounding as loud as the thunder overhead. They reached the ditch and collapsed together beside a battered guardrail. Jake crouched there, cradling the dog like a child, his breath turning to mist in the cold. His chest heaved. Rain streamed down his face, mingling with the grime and sweat already clinging to his skin. The dog licked his chin. Jake let out a breathless laugh, more from shock than amusement. "You got some nerve running into traffic, you know that?" The dog didn't answer, of course, just stared up at him with wide, grateful eyes. Beneath the grime and panic, there was something soft in its gaze, trusting. Like it knew he was the only thing standing between it and something far worse. For a long moment, they just stayed there, two soaked strays under the storm. Jake finally stood, dog still in his arms, legs trembling from adrenaline. He glanced back at the road traffic still flowing, drivers unaware that a tiny thread of fate had just been pulled taut in the middle of their Monday night. Then he turned toward his car. Neither of them noticed the SUV that had stopped farther down the road, or the woman stepping out into the rain, eyes wide with disbelief. Jake had just reached the edge of his car door when the low hum of an approaching engine cut through the rain. A sleek white SUV rolled to a stop a few yards away, its high beams slicing through the mist. It idled for a second, then the driver's door swung open. She stepped out without an umbrella, heels sinking slightly into the wet gravel. The rain didn't seem to bother her. Tall, poised, and wrapped in a long wool coat that was clearly expensive and completely soaked through, she moved with urgency, shoulders tense, eyes locked on the golden retriever in Jake's arms. "Emily," she called out, her voice cracking beneath the rain. It wasn't sharp, but raw, desperate. At the sound of her voice, the dog stirred. Its ears perked, and without hesitation, it squirmed out of Jake's grasp, hitting the ground in a splash of muddy water before bounding toward her. The woman dropped to her knees, right there on the shoulder of the road, arms open wide. The dog leapt into her embrace, whining, tail wagging, licking her face like it had been gone for years instead of minutes. Jake stood still, watching. His heart was still thudding in his chest, clothes clinging to him like second skin. He'd seen people reunited before, families, friends, kids, with their pets, but this felt different. There was something in the way she held that dog. As if letting go again wasn't even an option. She buried her face in the dog's wet fur, whispering soft words he couldn't hear. Then, slowly, she looked up at him. Her eyes were striking storm gray and rimmed with worry. She stood, the dog still close to her side, and walked toward Jake. Every step she took was composed, controlled, but there was no mistaking the weight behind them. "You saved her," she said softly, almost like it was hard to believe. "I thought she was gone." Jake shrugged, suddenly unsure what to do with his hands. "Just saw her run out, couldn't leave her." The woman studied him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching. Jake nodded. "Anytime." But even as he said it, he knew this wasn't the kind of moment you could just walk away from. The woman reached into her coat, pulling out a slim leather wallet that looked like it cost more than Jake's entire monthly rent. She didn't fumble, her movements were practiced, elegant, but her fingers shook ever so slightly as she slid out a stack of folded bills. "I insist," she said, stepping closer. Please. You could have been hit. People don't just run into traffic like that. Jake raised a hand, palm out. You don't need to do that. She looked confused. Not offended, just surprised, like this part always worked, like money always smoothed things over. You don't even know me, she said. You risked yourself for a dog that wasn't yours. You should be compensated. Jake gave a half shrug, water dripping from his sleeves. I didn't do it for compensation. But you. She needed help, he said, nodding toward the retriever now sitting loyally by her side, soaked and panting but clearly content. That's all there is to it. For a moment, the woman didn't move. The rain fell in steady waves, soaking them both to the bone. Cars passed, oblivious, the rest of the world continuing its routine while the three of them stood suspended in something quieter, stranger. Jake took a slow breath, letting the moment settle. Look, I fix things for a living. That's what I do. Sometimes it's a busted transmission. Sometimes it's a lost dog in the rain. You don't have to pay me to do what's right. The woman blinked, then slowly tucked the money back into her wallet. She glanced down at the dog, whose eyes never left Jake. I don't know what to say, she said finally, softer now. You already did, Jake replied. She's safe. That's what matters. Something shifted in her face, just a flicker. The distant elegance didn't vanish, but it cracked, just enough to show something real beneath it. Vulnerability. Gratitude. Maybe even awe. Jake nodded toward his car. You two take care. As he turned to go, he heard her voice again, barely above the rain. What's your name? He paused, hand on the car door. Jake. Jake Lawson. She smiled, almost imperceptibly. Thank you, Jake. Then he got in his car, started the engine, and drove away, leaving her and the dog behind in the rain, still watching. Jake didn't look back right away. The old sedan rumbled beneath him as he pulled back onto the slick road, windshield wipers squealing in protest. The golden retriever and her elegant owner faded in the rear-view mirror, swallowed by mist and rain. He gripped the wheel tighter than he needed to, jaw set, mind racing not with thoughts exactly, but with the residue of adrenaline. The way moments like that clung to the bones long after they passed. He should have asked her name. It hit him halfway down the hill, just past the turnoff for Elm Street. A sharp little nudge in the chest. Not regret, exactly, just unfinished. She had thanked him. Meant it, too. Her voice hadn't been polished or performative in that moment it had cracked, barely holding together. There was something underneath all that expensive wool and soft perfume, something raw. And she hadn't tried to hide it when she looked at him. Jake had seen plenty of people with money. They came through the shop now and then, travelers passing through, weekenders with lake houses. Most were impatient, always in a rush, always surprised by how slowly small towns moved. But she hadn't barked orders. She didn't even flinch when he refused the money. She'd just looked at him, like she wasn't used to being told no, but also like maybe, just maybe, she didn't mind hearing it. And then she was gone. He slowed at the corner of Maple and 6th, the light blinking yellow, casting gold onto the wet pavement. For a second, he considered turning back, just to see if she was still there, just to ask her name. But the storm was thick now, and he'd made his choice. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the rain had eased to a drizzle. The porch light glowed soft and steady. Emily's small backpack was still on the hook, her drawings from school tucked behind the screen door where Mrs. Place Pruitt always left them. Jake killed the engine and sat in silence for a beat. He didn't even know her name. But for some reason, it mattered more than he could explain. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Jake lay in the dark, one arm folded behind his head, the ceiling fan clicking softly above. The house was quiet, Emily's bedroom down the hall silent, except for the occasional rustle as she turned in her sleep. Outside, the rain had finally slowed to a steady whisper against the windows, like the storm had run out of things to say. But his mind hadn't. He stared at the ceiling, replaying it all. The screech of tires, The way the dog had bolted into the road, like it didn't care if it got hit. The horn. His feet, moving before his thoughts, caught up. Her voice. That look in her eyes. But it was the dog's eyes he couldn't stop seeing. Wide, golden brown, soulful. Not panicked. Even as chaos closed in, just scared and searching, like it had been running a long time, and didn't know where home was anymore. It reminded him of something, though he couldn't quite put a finger on what. Maybe the way Emily had looked that first year after Lucy died, brave on the outside, but always watching, always waiting for something to make sense again. Or maybe it was how Jake sometimes saw himself in the mirror when the shop was too quiet and the weight of everything caught up to him. That quiet ache. That question no one could answer. The dog hadn't barked, hadn't growled. It had just let him scoop it up, like it already knew he was safe, like it had chosen him. Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He wasn't the kind of guy who believed in fate or signs or all that cosmic stuff. Life was nuts and bolts, bills and busted mufflers. But still, something about that dog stuck with him. The way it looked at him, the way it trusted him without hesitation. And then there was the woman, elegant, composed. But the way she dropped to her knees in the rain, the way her voice broke, that was real. That was someone whose life wasn't as picture-perfect as it looked from the outside. Jake turned over, eyes heavy but still awake. The dog's eyes followed him into his dreams. The rain hadn't reached Manhattan yet, but the clouds outside the high-rise loft windows warned it was coming. The city buzzed below, horns, sirens, voices rising and falling like a living tidebud up here, in a space filled with the scent of linseed oil and turpentine. Everything was still. Serena Vale stood barefoot in front of a blank canvas. Her studio, an expansive corner of her loft, lined with tall windows and cluttered with brushes, frames, and half-finished works, was unusually quiet. No music played. No assistants flitted in and out with coffee or canvas samples. Just the creak of old floorboards beneath her and the soft thump of Emily's paws as the golden retriever padded behind her, tail swishing. Emily had barely left her side since the scare on the highway. Serena had dried her off with the softest towels in the loft, laid out a blanket, whispered apologies into her fur. But the tension still sat in her chest like a stone. She couldn't shake the image, Emily darting into traffic, Serena's feet frozen, helpless, and then him. The man in the rain. Soaked to the bone, jaw clenched, arms wrapped around her dog like he'd known her forever. She hadn't asked his name until the very end, and when he said it, Jake, it echoed strangely in her mind, like a line from a song she used to know. Serena blinked, fingers twitching at her side. The canvas waited, blank and judgmental. She'd spent the last 6 weeks trying to begin a new series of portraits meant to capture human truth, according to the gallery's pitch, but nothing had felt honest. Nothing moved her. Until now. She dipped her brush in charcoal gray and made the first stroke strong, purposeful. A jawline, wet hair clinging to a forehead, eyes narrowed not in anger, but in focus. A man who didn't hesitate, who didn't ask questions, who ran into the storm because it was the right thing to do. She painted the way he held Emily. The way he looked at her, not like a stranger, but like someone who understood what it meant to lose something you loved. She didn't know much about Jake Lawson. But as the image took shape on the canvas, she knew one thing with certainty. This was the most honest thing she'd painted in years. The city moved around Serena as it always did, fast, loud, relentless. But she moved slower now, quieter, like something in her had been reset that night on the highway. She hadn't stopped thinking about him, Jake Lawson. The name had stuck with her like a half-remembered dream, soft around the edges but impossible to shake. She said it out loud sometimes, just to hear how it sounded. Jake. The mechanic with rain-soaked hair, calm hands, and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and kept going anyway. She didn't know why she needed to find him. Not exactly. But the thought of letting that moment disappear, letting him disappear, sat wrong in her bones, so she started asking, not loudly, not publicly, Serena Vale wasn't someone who moved unnoticed, and she had no interest in turning him into a story or a spectacle. But quietly, carefully, she reached out to people she trusted. A friend who worked in logistics. A cousin who managed a regional dealership chain. Her gallery manager's brother, who grew up in upstate New York. The questions were simple, casual even. Do you know a small-town mechanic named Jake Lawson? Late 30s, maybe early 40s? Tall, dark hair, runs his own shop, somewhere rural. Sometimes she included the dog. He saved my golden retriever from traffic a few nights ago. Sometimes she didn't. The responses trickled in. Mostly dead ends. A few people sent back vague leads: Jake's in Ohio, a Lawson in Pennsylvania, a garage owner named Jacob in Vermont, who turned out to be 70 and retired. But she kept asking, because when she closed her eyes, she could still see him kneeling in the rain, arms wrapped around her dog, as if her safety mattered more than his own. He hadn't known who she was, hadn't asked, hadn't accepted a single dollar. Just helped, just was. Serena glanced over at the canvas again. It was nearly finished, Noah's likeness captured with startling accuracy, his expression somewhere between burden and peace. She wasn't done with the painting. Not yet. Not until she found him again. The tip came on a Thursday afternoon, tucked between a stack of emails Serena didn't care about and a lukewarm espresso she'd already forgotten she made. Subject: Re. Your mystery mechanic. Body: I think I found your guy. Jake Lawson. Owns a garage out in a town called Bridgefield. Population: tractors and one coffee shop. He fits the bill. Single dad. Locals love him. Total hero complex. Sound familiar? Serena read it 3 times. Bridgefield. The name meant nothing to her, but her pulse quickened. She clicked the link her friend had attached, an old article from the town's community blog. Nothing flashy. Just a photo of Jake standing outside his garage, with a school bus behind him, and a headline that read, "Mechanic donates time, keeps school fleet running." There he was. Same steady expression. Same broad shoulders, worn work shirt rolled at the sleeves. He wasn't smiling in the photo. Not really. But there was a warmth in his eyes that pulled at her in a way no gallery or gala ever had. Serena closed her laptop and stood up slowly. Emily, curled in the sun near the balcony door, lifted her head and wagged her tail. "Bridgefield, huh?" Serena murmured. The town wasn't far. A few hours upstate. Far enough from the spotlight, close enough for a coincidence. She couldn't call it fate, not out loud, but something about the pull in her chest told her she'd regret it if she didn't go. Of course, she didn't want to show up like herself. Not as Serena Vale, the $1 million artist with a Manhattan loft and a face that appeared in too many magazines. That wasn't who he met that night on the roadside. That wasn't the version of her who'd knelt in the rain, begging for her dog's life back. No, she'd go quiet. No entourage, no makeup. Just a woman with car trouble and questions she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. She opened her closet, pulling out a denim jacket and a pair of old boots she hadn't worn since college. If Jake Lawson had saved her dog without knowing who she was, then maybe she needed to meet him again without knowing who she was, too. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Serena eased the SUV into the lot. The sign above the garage read, "Lawson's Auto Repair," in hand-painted block letters, slightly faded by sun and time. The building was modest in roof, 2 garage bays, a small office with dusty windows, and a paper "Open" sign hanging slightly crooked. There were no sleek lounges, no espresso machines or polished tile floors, just honest work. Just Jake. Her pulse ticked up as she parked near the side and killed the engine. She stared through the windshield for a long beat, hands still on the wheel. Emily sat in the back seat, calm but alert, ears perked as if she too sensed something important about this place. "Okay," Serena whispered, smoothing her jacket. "You're just a woman with a sputtering engine and a few questions. No makeup, hair tied back, plain clothes." She'd rehearsed this. "Stay casual. Don't oversell it. Don't slip." She opened the door and stepped out into the warm afternoon sun. The scent of oil and metal hung thick in the air, and somewhere inside, a drill whined against a stubborn bolt. The office door creaked as she pushed it open. A bell jingled overhead. From the far end of the garage, a familiar voice called out, low and steady, "Be right with you." Her heart stuttered. Moments later, Jake appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a rag, the same grease-streaked look he wore the night they met. He glanced up and, for a split second, his eyes narrowed like something stirred in the back of his mind, but it passed. He didn't recognize her. Not yet. "What seems to be the problem?" he asked, voice casual, but not unfriendly. Serena took a slow breath. "Engine's been cutting out. It's probably nothing, but I figured I should get it checked before it turns into something worse." Jake nodded and reached for the clipboard by the desk. "You're smart to bring it in. Pop the hood, I'll take a look." As he walked past her, focused on the task at hand, Serena glanced down at Emily through the window. The dog watched Jake intently, tail thumping against the seat. If he remembered anything, he didn't show it. But something told her he would. The hood creaked open, and steam hissed faintly as Jake leaned over the engine, brows furrowed in concentration. His hands moved with quiet precision, checking the hoses, inspecting the wiring, brushing his fingers along the battery line like he was listening to something only he could hear. Serena stood nearby, arms crossed, pretending to study the wall of faded inspection stickers and dusty license plates nailed above the workbench, but her eyes kept drifting back to him. Jake knew. He'd known the second she stepped through the door. That same quiet intensity. The dog in her back seat. The way she carried herself like someone used to control but not immune to chaos. She looked different now, stripped down, low-key. But there was no mistaking her. He remembered everything. Her face, her voice. The way she'd clutched the dog in the rain, like it was the only thing holding her together. Still, he said nothing. She hadn't offered her name, and he wasn't the type to push. If she wanted to pretend they were strangers, he'd let her. For now. He glanced sideways, just for a second. She was watching him. Not impatiently, not like a woman checking her watch while her tires got rotated. She watched like she was seeing something she didn't expect, like she was studying more than his hands. He felt her gaze like a warm weight between his shoulder blades. Jake cleared his throat and straightened. "Looks like you've got a bad ignition coil. It's not major, but it could cause more issues if you let it go too long." Serena nodded slowly, like she was trying to decide if she should be relieved or disappointed. "Can you fix it?" she asked. Jake cracked a smile, small, but genuine. "Yeah, won't take long. Want to wait in the office?" She hesitated. "Actually, I don't mind hanging around here, if that's okay." Jake studied her for a beat. Most folks didn't want to sit around a garage smelling like diesel and hot metal, but she did. And for some reason that mattered more than it should have. "Sure," he said quietly. "Suit yourself." He turned back to the engine, her presence still warm at his back. He didn't ask why she'd come. He figured if she was here, she'd tell him when she was ready. The soft clink of metal against metal echoed through the garage as Jake worked beneath the open hood, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands moving with effortless rhythm. Serena sat nearby on an overturned milk crate, legs crossed, her coat folded neatly beside her. She didn't mind the grease or the smell. In fact, there was something oddly grounding about it. Everything here felt real, untouched by performance or polish. "So," Jake said, not looking up, "what brings you to Bridgefield? Not exactly a tourist destination." Serena hesitated, watching him swap out the ignition coil. "Passing through," she said casually. "Needed a break from the city. Things get loud." He chuckled. "Yeah, they do. I went to New York once. College friend dragged me there for a concert. Too many people, too much concrete." She smiled. "What concert?" "Springsteen. 9. Guy knows how to hold a crowd." Serena's brows lifted. "The boss? I'm impressed." Jake glanced at her, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "What? I don't look like a Springsteen guy?" You look like someone who listens to whatever's playing in the background. Jake laughed. That's not wrong. Serena leaned back, resting her hands on the edge of the workbench. I'm more of a blues girl myself. Etta James, Otis Redding. Stuff you can feel in your chest. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Good taste. There was a comfortable pause, the silence filled only by the soft purr of the radio in the corner and the rustle of the wind through the garage door. Then Serena tilted her head. Favorite food? She asked. Jake didn't even pause. Grilled cheese, with tomato soup. Classic combo. You? She grinned. Fresh bread, butter. Nothing else, just that. He looked over at her. You eat just bread? Don't knock it till you've had it in a little Paris cafe at 2 in the morning with too much wine and not enough sense. Jake shook his head, a slow smile spreading. Sounds like there's a story there. There's always a story, she said, her voice softer now. And then she laughed light, effortless, real. The kind of laugh that didn't belong in a gallery opening or a press interview. It belonged here, in a garage that smelled like gasoline and memories. Jake tightened the last bolt, stealing a glance her way. He liked that sound more than he expected. The next morning brought sun-real sun for the first time in days. It filtered through the clouds in soft golden streaks, warming the pavement outside Lawson's Auto like a promise. Jake had just finished tuning up an old Civic when he heard the crunch of gravel out front. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out into the light. Squinting slightly, the white SUV was back. Jake raised an eyebrow as the door swung open, and Serena stepped out more casual this time. Fitted jeans, worn boots, sunglasses perched on her head. But it wasn't her that caught his eye. It was the golden retriever bounding out from the back seat, tail wagging in full-blown excitement. Emily? Jake said, startled into a grin. The dog sprinted toward him with zero hesitation, tongue out, ears flopping like she'd been waiting for this moment since the night he pulled her out of traffic. She skidded to a stop just short of him and pressed her nose into his leg, then sat back on her haunches, gazing up like he was her long-lost hero. Jake crouched down and ruffled her damp fur. Hey girl, you remember me, huh? Emily barked once, tail thumping wildly against the ground. Serena watched from the passenger side, arms folded, and a soft smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She hasn't stopped pacing by the door since we left yesterday. I figured she earned a visit. Jake looked up at her. She's got good memory. Or good instincts, Serena replied, walking closer. She trusts people faster than I do, always has. He didn't know what to say to that, so he scratched behind Emily's ears and nodded. Well, she's welcome anytime. Serena's smile lingered. Mind if we hang out a bit? I don't have anywhere else to be. Jake stood, brushing off his hands. Sure, I've got another oil change to knock out, but you're free to supervise. I'm a world-class supervisor, she deadpanned, and Emily barked again, as if in agreement. As Jake returned to his work and Serena leaned against the garage wall, Emily laid herself at his feet, content and calm. And for a while, the three of them just existed together, easy and unhurried, like they'd done this 100 times before. The day drifted past in slow, golden pieces. Serena stayed longer than she'd planned, perched on an upturned toolbox as Jake worked through a steady stream of neighborhood cars. They didn't talk much after the initial banter, just the occasional question or passing remark, but the silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable. Like background music you didn't realize you'd started humming along to. Emily snoozed in the sun near the garage door, paws twitching as she dreamed. Jake glanced up from under the hood of a battered Ford, catching Serena mid-sip from a water bottle. Her eyes met his, and for a second, neither looked away. Then she stood, brushing off her jeans. "Do you ever take a break?" she asked, nodding toward the garage clock. "It's past 2. Jake wiped his hands on a rag. "Breaks are for when the work's done," Serena smiled. "That's a terrible philosophy." He shrugged. "Comes with the territory." She stepped closer, stopping just shy of the grease, stained concrete. "I was thinking," she began, hesitating. "There's a place a few blocks down, tiny diner, smells like burnt toast and good coffee. I passed it this morning." Jake arched a brow. "The Silver Spoon? That's the one." "It's not bad," he admitted. "Terrible coffee. Amazing pie." "Well," she said, slipping her hands into her jacket pockets, "maybe you could show me." Jake didn't answer right away. He looked at her, really looked. The way her voice dipped when she was unsure. The way she stood with her weight on one foot, like she wasn't sure whether to stay or go. It wasn't a line. It wasn't a performance. Still, something in him tensed. He wasn't used to this, being invited, noticed, asked. Not like this, not by someone like her. "Are you asking me out?" he asked, half teasing, half guarded. Serena tilted her head. "I'm asking if you want coffee. If it turns into something else, we'll figure it out." Jake let out a slow breath and glanced at the clock again. "I could do coffee," he said finally. "As long as you're not expecting anything fancy." She smiled bright and real. Burnt toast and amazing pie sounds just right. And somehow it did. The Manhattan loft was quiet when Serena returned, an almost sacred kind of silence that only came late at night, when the city outside slowed to a whisper and the elevator no longer rattled with comings and goings. She dropped her keys in the ceramic bowl near the door, toed off her boots, and padded across the hardwood floor with Emily trailing faithfully at her heels. The studio lights were still on. She hadn't touched the canvas in 2 days. Not since she'd driven to Bridgefield on a whim and walked into a garage smelling of oil and honest labor. Not since Jake had looked at her not as a stranger, not as a celebrity, but as someone he might actually trust. She moved to the easel and stood in front of it, arms folded. The painting stared back at her, nearly finished, but still missing something. It was him, Jake, kneeling, in the middle of a storm-drenched road, soaked through, arms wrapped around Emily's trembling frame. The background was a blur of headlights and rain, cars fading into the gray like ghosts. But it wasn't about the scene. It was about the moment. His face was etched with urgency, and something quieter beneath it, compassion maybe. Fear, even. Not for himself, for the dog. For something that couldn't speak for itself but still mattered. That was what had stopped her in her tracks that night. Not just that he'd saved Emily, but that he hadn't thought twice about it. Serena picked up her brush and dipped it into a dark, moody wash of blue. She added a few strokes to the sky, deepening the weight of the clouds above him. Then a faint glint of light on his cheekbone reflected rain, or maybe something else. A glimmer of warmth, of heart, of humanity. She stepped back, studied it, and felt her throat tighten. This wasn't just a painting. It wasn't a commission or a showpiece or part of her next gallery series. It was something real. A piece of a man she barely knew and couldn't seem to forget. Serena lowered the brush, wiped her hands on her apron, and whispered to the empty room, "Now it's done." But she knew, deep down, the story was just beginning. The Silver Spoon was the kind of diner where time hung heavy in the air, like the smell of old coffee and fried bacon. Vinyl booths creaked when you sat down, and every table had a sugar dispenser that stuck just slightly when you poured. It wasn't stylish, but it was warm, familiar, honest. Jake slid into the corner booth and watched Serena settle across from him, her jacket already draped on the seat beside her, her hair pulled back in a loose braid. The waitress didn't recognize Herond. Serena seemed to like it that way. No wide-eyed stares, no phones held up for pictures. Just a menu, a pot of black coffee, and a crooked smile from someone named Denise, who called everyone on. "You weren't kidding," Serena said, eyeing her mug. "This coffee could remove paint," Jake smirked. "Told you, but the pie's worth it." And it was. Cherry, thick and tart, with a crust that crumbled just right. She took one bite and raised a brow, conceding the point. The conversation started with safe things. Movies, music. The weird guy at the gas station with 3 parrots on his shoulder. But somewhere between refills and shared bites of pie, it shifted. Jake talked about the shop, how it had belonged to his dad before him, how every tool on the wall had a story. How raising Emily alone meant he rarely had time for anything beyond work and bedtime stories. Serena listened, chin resting on her hand, eyes soft. She told him about growing up in Boston, about skipping art school shows to wander through alleys taking pictures of strangers. How her first gallery show was a fluke, and everything after that had felt like trying to catch up to a version of herself she didn't quite believe in. They laughed more than either of them expected. Not the polite kind, but real, breath-stealing laughter that left their cheeks flushed and eyes bright. They lost track of the hours, the plates cleared, the diner half empty now. At one point, Serena looked up and blinked. How is it already dark? Jake glanced out the window and shook his head. Guess we got carried away. Neither of them said it, but both were thinking the same thing. They hadn't wanted it to end. The night was thick with the scent of pine and cooling asphalt as they stepped out of the diner, the last dregs of twilight fading behind the trees. Serena walked beside Jake in easy silence, her hands tucked into her jacket pockets, Emily trotting a few paces ahead on a leash that had somehow materialized from Jake's truck. The dog sniffed at everything, content in her own little world. Jake's hands were in his pockets too, his shoulders slightly hunched not from the cold, but from something older. He wasn't a man who rushed to fill silences, but tonight felt different. The laughter from the diner still hung between them, and something about the way Serena looked at him, like she wasn't trying to fix him, just see him, made the words start to rise. "My dad built the garage," he said quietly, eyes on the sidewalk. "Started it in the 70s, ran it until he got sick." Serena turned her head toward him, not interrupting. "I was going to leave, you know," he said with a short laugh. "After high school, I had this idea I'd go to Chicago, study engineering, maybe design cars instead of fixing other people's. But then my mom got sick, then Dad. Then Emily came along." He paused, kicking a pebble into the gutter. "Life has a way of changing the map on you. One minute you've got a plan. The next, you're 22, your parents are gone, and there's a baby in the house who calls you Daddy, even though she doesn't understand why her real one isn't around anymore." Serena's breath caught. She hadn't expected that, not the softness in his voice or the weight behind it. Jake glanced at her, half apologetic. "Sorry, that's probably more than you wanted to hear." "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear." He gave her a small, grateful smile, then looked back toward the darkened street. "The shop's not flashy, but it's honest. I guess I thought if I couldn't chase the big dreams, I could at least build something steady, something that didn't break the way people do." They walked in silence for a beat, their steps in sync, and in that quiet space between words, Serena reached out and gently slipped her hand into his. Jake didn't let go. The city felt like another planet. Jake had been to Manhattan once before briefly, back when he was younger, and thought fast places meant better lives. But nothing about this visit felt rushed. Serena didn't bring him to the glitzy parts. No champagne parties, no sweeping rooftop views, just a quiet elevator, a quiet hallway, and a key that clicked into a weathered lock. Her loft was warm in the way few big spaces were exposed brick walls, tall windows with sheer white curtains that danced in the breeze, and a faint smell of lavender and oil paint in the air. The floor creaked softly beneath their steps, and the walls were dotted with artwork in various stages of becoming. Jake looked around, taking it in slowly. "This is where the magic happens?" Serena chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes. Sometimes it's just where I stare at a blank canvas and question every decision I've ever made." He wandered deeper in, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, eyes scanning the canvases, abstracts, portraits. A piece that looked like grief and color had collided in the same breath, and then he stopped. In the far corner, beneath a high window, stood an easel, and on it a painting he hadn't expected to see. It was him. Kneeling in the rain, soaked to the bone, arms wrapped around Emily. The chaos of headlights blurred behind him. The storm streaked in every brushstroke, and his face, not heroic, Not proud. Just tired. Focused. Human. He didn't say anything at first. Just stared, breath caught somewhere in his chest. Serena stepped beside him. "I painted it the night after I found you." Jake finally turned toward her, eyes searching. "Why?" "Because I couldn't stop seeing it," she said quietly. "Not just what you did, but why you did it. That kind of kindness, it doesn't come with conditions. It's rare. And rare things deserve to be seen." He looked back at the painting, still stunned. "You didn't even know me." "I didn't have to," she said. And somehow, in that quiet studio far above the city noise, Jake felt more seen than he ever had in his life. The silence in the studio had shifted. Jake stood a few steps back from the painting now, his jaw tight, hands clenched loosely at his sides. The image on the canvas hadn't changed, but something in him had. The weight of it pressed in, not just the art, but the revelation behind it. Not just that Serena had painted him, but that she had known who he was all along. He turned to her, voice low but sharp at the edges. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Serena froze, surprise flashing across her face. "Tu didn't think it mattered." "It matters," he said, the words clipped, not angry, but wounded. "You show up at my garage pretending you're just passing through. No last name, no hints, just questions and smiles like it's all casual." "I wasn't pretending," she said quickly. "I just didn't want you to look at me the way everyone else does. Like the artist, the name, the money. I didn't want that to be what you saw." Jake let out a short, bitter laugh. "Right. So you let me talk like I was just some mechanic patching up your ignition, while you already knew what you were going to do: paint me, hang me in a gallery, sell me to the highest bidder?" Her eyes widened. "No, God, no, that's not what this is. That painting's not for sale. I never meant to exploit anything. I painted it because that moment meant something. To me, to Emily." Jake looked away, his throat tight. "You should have told me." "I was scared," she admitted, softer now. "Scared you'd shut down, that you'd think I was there to collect a story, not to understand it." He didn't answer right away. The trust they'd built, the late-night walks, the diner laughs, the quiet moments suddenly felt fragile. Like a bridge she hadn't meant to burn, but had scorched anyway. Finally, he met her eyes. "I don't need people to understand me, I just need them to be honest." Serena swallowed hard. "I was honest, just not at the beginning." Jake nodded slowly, his face unreadable. Then he turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind him, leaving her standing alone in the echo of her truth. The rain returned the next daylight, persistent, draping the city in a cold, gray stillness. Serena sat alone at the kitchen island, her untouched mug of tea growing cold. Fingers curled tightly around the ceramic, as if holding it would keep her grounded. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the look on Jake's face, surprised, hurt, betrayed. And worse than his silence had been his eyes, not angry, just disappointed. It carved deeper than anything he could have said. Emily padded in from the living room and nudged her knee with a soft whine. Serena reached down, running a hand through her fur, grateful for the one creature who didn't look at her differently. She didn't know where to start, but she knew she had to try. By noon, she was on the road, a duffel bag in the trunk, her hair tied back, no makeup, no studio gloss, just Serena. Or whatever version of herself she used to be before the world began painting over the edges. Bridgefield greeted her with its usual quiet. The trees still wet from the rain, the streets half empty, the diner sign flickering like always. She pulled into Lawson's auto and sat in the car for a long minute before getting out. Jake was under the hood of an old truck, his sleeves rolled up, face shadowed, focused. When he looked up, he didn't seem surprised. "Hey," she said gently. "Hey." "I came to talk," she offered. "To explain." He nodded once but didn't move from where he stood. "I should have told you who I was from the beginning. I didn't lie, but I also didn't trust you enough to be real. And that's not on you. That's on me." Jake closed the hood with a firm thunk and leaned against the truck. His jaw was tight, but his voice was calm. "I just needed it to be what it was. No games, no angles." "I know," she said. "And I ruined that." They stood in silence, the space between them stretching. Jake finally pushed off the truck and walked past her toward the garage. "I just need some time," he said without looking back. And this time, Serena let him go. The gallery was buzzing, all clean white walls and sharp black suits, the kind of place where silence felt curated, and even the champagne bubbles moved in measured rhythm. Serena stood near the back, arms folded, eyes distant as people flitted around her collectors, critics, curators, and the ever-hovering presence of her agent, Madison, who spoke in a clipped, rehearsed tone even when no one was listening. "You haven't confirmed the final piece," Madison was saying, flipping through her tablet with the urgency of someone who lived for deadlines. "We need the anchor work. Something with teeth, something personal." Serena didn't answer. Her gaze drifted toward the far corner of the gallery mock-up, where a large blank space waited empty frame, empty wall. A placeholder for what Madison had been calling the mechanic painting, the Jake portrait. "I've already sent you 20 pieces," Serena said, her voice quieter than usual but firm. "That should be enough." Madison lowered the tablet. "You know that's not how this works. The other pieces are strong, sure. But that one, that's different. It's raw. It's not just technique, it's honest. That's what people want now, Serena. Truth. Vulnerability." "It's not for them," Serena said flatly. Madison blinked. "You've never pulled a piece. What is this really about?" Serena turned, slowly, finally meeting her agent's eyes. "It's about the fact that not everything real is meant to be consumed. That painting? It's not a product. It's a moment. His moment. And I don't need a room full of strangers clapping for something they don't understand." A beat of silence passed. Madison shifted her weight, adjusting her tone. "Serena, this is the New York showcase. This is the one that changes everything. You hang that piece, and we're talking front-page coverage? Major press." I said no. The words cut cleanly through the room. Madison opened her mouth, then closed it again, reading the finality in Serena's posture. Serena turned away, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, the sound swallowed by the weight of 1,000 expectations she no longer cared to carry. Let them have the show, but Jake's story that was hers to protect. The thunder came in low, distant rolls at first, soft enough to ignore, almost soothing in its rhythm. But by late evening, the sky had cracked wide open, and the rain came hard and fast, lashing against the windows of Jake's house with a kind of fury that demanded attention. He stood in the doorway of the living room, one hand braced against the old wooden frame, staring out into the dark. Lightning lit up the sky in flashes white veins across a charcoal canvas. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone, sharp and familiar. The storm brought it all back. Not just the night he'd pulled a trembling golden retriever out of traffic, but everything that had followed. Serena. Her voice in the rain. The quiet way she'd watched him from the garage wall, like she was seeing something no one else had bothered to look for. The feel of her hand slipping into his on that walk home. And then the painting. God, the painting. Jake had told himself he wasn't angry. But the truth was murkier than that. It wasn't about betrayal, not really. It was about exposure. Being seen in a way he hadn't asked for. Vulnerable, open, unguarded. He hadn't realized just how carefully he'd built his world until someone stepped into it and held up a mirror. And yet, he missed her. The thought came without permission, sharp and sudden. Not just the way she laughed, or the way she always seemed to say something deeper without trying, but the quiet between them. How it didn't have to be filled, how it just was. Emily padded over to him, tail swishing gently. She pressed her nose to his leg, then sat at his feet like she always did when she sensed something was wrong. He looked down at her, the same dog that had started all of this, and let out a slow breath. "It's just a storm," he murmured. But he knew it wasn't. Not really. The storm outside was weather. The one inside him was something else, entirely something unfinished, something that wouldn't let go. The attic smelled like dust and old wood, the kind of scent that clung to memory more than clothes. Jake hadn't been up there in years, not since before Emily was born, not since before the house felt like something he had to hold together with both hands. The storm had knocked the power out, and with nothing else to do, he'd climbed the stairs on instinct more than purpose, flashlight in hand, its beam slicing through the shadows like a searchlight. The boxes were just where he remembered, them stacked beneath a faded quilt, the corners sagging from time and humidity. He moved slowly, lifting lids, brushing off layers of forgotten years, tools, old photo albums, his mother's recipe cards. Then, near the bottom of one box, marked, "Dad, Personal," he found them. Letters, dozens of them. Yellowed envelopes with creases like crow's feet, each one written in his father's unmistakable scrawl-tight, neat, careful. Some were addressed to his mother, some had no names at all. Just thoughts. Jake sat down cross-legged, the floor creaking beneath him, and opened the first. September 17th, 1984. Sometimes I think people don't come into the garage because their cars are broken. Sometimes they just want to be seen, heard, fixed in the places no one talks about. Another. You ever notice how an engine always gives a warning before it fails? A rattle, a hiss, a flicker on the dash. People do the same thing. Most just don't know how to look for the signs. And another. Love's not about getting it right. It's about showing up anyway. About putting your hands in the mess and choosing it. Over and over. Jake read until his eyes blurred. Until the storm faded into a soft patter on the roof. Then he found one near the bottom, folded in thirds, more worn than the rest. Jake, if you ever find this, it means I didn't get to say everything I wanted. So here's the short version. Love big. Risk more. And don't let fear keep you from someone who sees you. Sometimes, a broken-down engine fixes more than just itself. Sometimes it fixes a heart. Jake swallowed hard, blinking against the burn in his eyes. Maybe he hadn't been as lost as he thought. Maybe it was time to go back. The morning air was crisp. The kind that hinted at autumn, even though summer hadn't officially let go. Bridgefield was quiet, still stretching awake, and the hum of birdsong was the only soundtrack as Serena walked down the narrow road toward Lawson's Auto, thermos in one hand, the other shoved deep into her coat pocket. She hadn't brought the SUV. No dramatic re-entrance. No engine trouble to hide behind. Just her tired, hopeful, stripped of everything but honesty. The garage came into view, its door rolled halfway up, the scent of motor oil already floating on the breeze. Jake was bent under the hood of a pickup, unaware of her presence at first. Serena stopped at the edge of the lot, just outside the gravel, and waited. When he finally looked up, she didn't wave or smile or fill the space with nervous words. She just held up the thermos. Jake stood slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes were guarded, but not cold. "I figured," she said, stepping closer. "If I ever showed up here again, it should be with coffee and the truth." He raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "I messed up," Serena continued. "Not because I painted you. That came from a real place. But because I walked into your life wearing a mask and then got upset when you saw through it." Still quiet, she set the thermos on the workbench. "You didn't ask for any of this, and I didn't come to ask for anything either. I just wanted you to know. I see it now. What you gave me. That moment. It wasn't about a dog or a painting. It was about being seen." Jake exhaled, slow and steady. Then, finally, he stepped toward her. "You didn't have to come back." "I did," she said. "Not for the painting, not for closure, for you." He looked at the thermos, then at her. "You remembered how I take it?" he asked softly. "No cream, little sugar, just enough to take the edge off." A pause. A flicker of something that might have been a smile. Jake nodded. "Okay," he said. Let's start there. The loft was quiet again, but this time it didn't feel empty. Jake stood in the center of Serena's studio, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes roaming the tall walls and scattered canvases. Everything smelled faintly of paint, and rain, the kind of scent that lingered in places where people created things from pieces of themselves. Emily paced slowly around the room, sniffing corners, occasionally glancing at Serena like she was making sure it was okay to be here. Serena stood beside a large canvas draped in white linen. Her fingers hovered near the edge of the cloth but didn't move just yet. "I wasn't going to show this to anyone," she said quietly. "It wasn't meant for a gallery, or press, or collectors." Jake said nothing, but the weight in his expression told her he understood. He was watching her, not with suspicion, but with something deeper, something steady. She took a breath and pulled the linen free. The portrait stood tall and quiet, as if it had always belonged to this room. Jake, kneeling in the rain, soaked and bracing, one arm wrapped tightly around Emily's trembling body. The chaos of the road behind him was blurred into soft motion, but his face was in perfect focus. Not dramatic, not posed, just present, grounded. His eyes were tired, but full of something unspoken: resolve, tenderness, the kind of quiet strength that doesn't need to announce itself. "This is how I saw you," Serena said, her voice just above a whisper. "That moment, it mattered to me." Jake stepped closer, eyes locked on the painting. He didn't speak for a long time, just stood there, hands still in his pockets, staring at a version of himself he wasn't sure he'd ever seen before. "You got the rain right," he finally said, his voice thick. "That was the loudest part." Serena smiled faintly. "I wasn't painting the rain." He looked at her then, the words sinking in, quiet and undeniable. She took a small step closer. "I'm not asking for anything, Jake. I just wanted you to have this. You changed something in me that night. This is how I remember it, how I'll always remember it." He nodded slowly, eyes returning to the canvas. "It's me," he said softly. "But it's more than that." "It's the truth," she replied. And in that stillness, something between them settled back into Placeno. Longer, broken, but transformed. It started slow, like everything with Jake did. No dramatic speeches, no sweeping declarations. Just a quiet moment in Serena's studio, two people standing in the glow of something real, letting silence do what words couldn't. Jake didn't say the word forgive, but she saw it in the way his shoulders eased, in the way he looked at her and didn't look away. The next day, he showed up at her hotel with coffee. "Figured you might be tired of loft brew," he said, handing her a cup without fanfare. She smiled. "Depends. Did you put in just enough sugar to take the edge off?" He didn't answer. He just started walking, and so they walked through the heart of Bridgefield, side by side, past the diner, past the hardware store, past the kids riding bikes down cracked sidewalks. Emily trotted ahead of them, tail high and happy, greeting every dog and stranger like she belonged there. Maybe she did. People looked. Of course they did. Serena Valethi. Serena Vale wasn't the kind of woman this town saw twice, let alone strolling Main Street in jeans and a borrowed flannel. Holding coffee and laughing at something, Jake muttered under his breath. Heads turned behind shop windows. A few folks nodded, some whispered. One teenager took a not-so-subtle picture with his phone. Jake noticed, but he didn't slow down. "I forgot what it's like," Serena said, watching a woman elbow her husband and nod in their direction. "What?" "To be seen like this. Not in a headline. Just as a person." Jake glanced over at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. Bridgefield's not great at subtlety, but it is good at showing its heart. They walked past the old movie theater, its marquee missing letters, the same film playing for the third week in a row. Jake pointed at it. "You ever seen Casablanca?" Serena grinned. "Only 100 times." "Good," he said. "They've got a popcorn machine that works half the time. Might be a gamble." "Worth it," she replied. They walked on, unhurried. The stares continued, but neither of them cared. When art met real life, it turned out, it looked a lot like this. Two people with weathered pasts, an open road ahead, and no need for anything more than each other's presence. The gallery buzzed with anticipation. The walls gleamed white under soft lighting, and glasses of champagne clinked as New York's art elite circled the room like slow-moving satellites. Critics, collectors, journalists, all of them, drawn by the promise of Serena Vale's latest work. A return to form, they called it, a new era of emotional realism. What none of them knew was that the anchor of it all, the centerpiece painting whispered about in teasers and press previews, came with one condition: Jake had to be there. At first he'd said no. Of course he had. "I don't belong in rooms like that," he'd muttered, brushing his hand through his hair as they sat on her couch 2 nights earlier. "I'm not some symbol." "You're not a symbol," Serena had replied gently. "You're a person. That's why the painting matters. That's why I want you there, not the idea of you, just you." So now, here he was, hair combed, shirt tucked, a jacket that didn't quite hide the grease stain on his wrist from fixing a neighbor's carburetor that morning. He stood just inside the gallery doors, stiff at first, eyes scanning the space with the same quiet observation he used when looking under a car hood. And then he saw it. The painting hung in the center of the far wall, framed in nothing but simple black wood. "Jake in the Rain," the critics would later call it. Serena had titled it "Steady Hands." Guests surrounded it, murmuring softly, trying to name what it was they were feeling. Jake didn't move until Serena appeared beside him, radiant in a charcoal dress that somehow made her look softer, not smaller. Her hand slipped into his. "You okay?" she asked. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I am." They approached the painting together, and a hush fell around them. People glanced, whispered. A few recognized Jake from the rumors, the magazine blurb, the behind-the-scenes leak Serena had never confirmed, but none of that mattered. Jake stared at his painted self, rain pouring down, arms wrapped around a frightened dog, and for the first time, he didn't feel exposed. He felt honored. The reviews came faster than Serena had expected, faster than Jake could brace himself for. By the next morning, the painting was everywhere. "Steady Hands," they called it, raw, unfiltered. A moment of stillness in a chaotic world. Vale's most personal and transcendent work to date. A masterpiece of humanity hiding in plain sight. Art blogs, newspapers, morning shows. Critics dissected every brushstroke, waxed poetic about composition and emotional texture, debated the meaning of the rain. But none of them talked about what really mattered: the man in the painting. The quiet reason it existed in the first place. Jake stood in Serena's loft, coffee in hand, thumbing through a thick magazine that had landed on her doorstep that morning. His face stared back at him from a 2-page spread. He didn't look like a hero. He looked tired, focused, real. He let out a breath and handed it back to her. "It's a lot." "I know. They're making it bigger than it is." "Maybe," Serena said, watching him carefully. "But maybe that moment was already big. Maybe the world just finally noticed." Jake didn't answer right away. He crossed the room and stared out the tall windows. The city moved below them, fast, loud, indifferent. And yet, here he was, standing in a space built for a world he never thought he'd be part of. "I didn't do anything special," he said quietly. "You didn't need to," she replied. "You did something true. That's rarer than most people think." Jake turned toward her, eyes still clouded with uncertainty. "I'm just a guy who fixes cars." "No," she said, walking over. "You're a guy who ran into traffic for a dog you didn't know. A guy who raised a child that wasn't his because it was the right thing to do. You're the kind of person people don't expect to exist. That's what they're seeing." He looked down at his hands, rough, calloused, scarred in places no critic would ever notice. "They act like I saved the world." Serena reached for him, her fingers curling gently around his. "You saved mine," she whispered. And for once, Jake didn't argue. The renovation wasn't flashy. There were no ribbon cuttings, no photographers, no grand opening banners flapping in the wind. Just fresh paint, upgraded tools, a new roof that didn't leak when it rained, and a modest wooden sign above the entrance with clean black lettering. Lawson. Vale Motors. Jake hadn't wanted the name at first. "This is your shop," he told her when she brought it up. "It always has been." But Serena had smiled and said, "Not anymore." It started with small things. New hydraulic lifts to replace the ones that groaned with age. A better heater for the office in winter. Lighting that didn't flicker and hum like a dying wasp. Serena never made a production out of it. She didn't throw money around or try to turn the garage into something it wasn't. She just asked what would make this easier, better, more sustainable. And Jake, slowly, let her help. He worked every day like he always had under the hood, covered in grease, giving every job the same attention, whether it was a luxury coupe or a farmer's old pickup. But there was a new ease in his step, a quiet pride in the way he handed keys back to customers, leaning against the counter with a coffee mug that said, "You break it, I fix it." Serena came by most mornings now. Sometimes she brought coffee, sometimes she brought Emily. She never hovered, just stayed nearby, sketchpad in her lap, or helping organize parts, or sitting on the porch with a book while Jake worked. It felt natural, like she'd always been part of the rhythm. Locals got used to her. They stopped whispering, started waving. One afternoon, Old Man Keller brought her a jar of homemade peach jam and said, "Didn't figure a woman like you for garage folk. Glad I was wrong." Jake had chuckled for a full 5 minutes after that. On the day the new sign went up, Serena stood beside him in the soft morning light, watching the paint dry. "You sure about the name?" she asked, gently teasing. Jake nodded. "Yeah, you helped build it." He didn't say "this is yours too," but she heard it in the quiet between them. And she believed him. Emily had a rhythm all her own now. In the mornings, she rode with Serena to the studio, her head poking out the passenger window, ears flapping in the wind. She'd trot into the loft like she owned the place, tail wagging, doing a quick loop around the room before settling in her usual sunspot by the window, watching the city stir to life below. By midday, she was back in Jake's truck, her paws on the dash as they cruised down the highway toward Bridgefield. She'd hop out the moment they reached the garage, darting past customers and straight through the open bay door to her spot near the workbench, a repurposed dog bed with a squeaky wrench-shaped toy Serena had picked out just because she thought it was funny. "She's got a better commute than I do," Jake grumbled once, and Serena just smiled. But Emily didn't care about the studio or the garage. She cared about them. She moved easily between their lives, between the paint and the tools, the noise and the stillness. At the loft, she curled up beside Serena while she sketched. At the shop, she watched Jake work, occasionally pawing at him when she wanted attention or a bite of his sandwich. She had become more than a pet. She was a thread, a quiet connection that reminded them where it all began. "She's basically running our schedule now," Serena joked one afternoon, brushing dog hair off her jeans as Emily lay stretched across the office couch. Jake glanced over from under a lifted SUV. "Not a bad boss." Emily thumped her tail in agreement. People started to notice. Customers who came to the garage would bring treats. Visitors to Serena's loft often stopped to take pictures, calling her the dog from the painting. But fame never fazed Emily. She wanted only the people who mattered, the ones who had been there in the rain, the ones who still showed up every day. At night, she curled between them on the couch, one paw on Jake's knee, her head resting against Serena's leg. 2 worlds, 1 dog. And somehow, it all fit. The light was golden, the kind that only came at the end of a long, honest day. It spilled through the open garage doors in slow, lazy waves, casting a warm hue over the workbench, the shelves lined with tools, the dust dancing in the air like it had nowhere else to be. Serena sat on a stool just outside the bay, her easel propped in front of her, brush balanced between her fingers. She hadn't said much in the past hour. She didn't need to. Jake was nearby, tightening a bolt on an old Harley someone had left for repair, whistling under his breath. Emily lay sprawled at his feet, a grease rag for a pillow and a small fleck of paint on her nose from earlier. The canvas in front of Serena was nearly complete. It wasn't like the others. There was no intensity, no drama. Just a moment quiet, lived in, true. Jake, in his usual work shirt, crouched next to Emily, his hand resting on her back. Serena herself was in the frame too, leaning against the doorway, a cup of coffee in hand, eyes soft with something between peace and belonging. The light of the setting sun wrapped them all in amber, as if the world had paused just to hold them still. She added one last stroke, just a glimmer of orange, where the sunlight hit Jake's shoulder, and then leaned back. "That's it," she whispered, not to anyone, not for approval, just the truth. Jake looked over, wiping his hands on a rag. "Done?" She nodded. "Yeah, this one's not for the world." He walked over and stood behind her, looking at the canvas. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then his hand settled gently on her shoulder. "It looks like home." Serena smiled without looking away from the painting. "It is home." Emily let out a sleepy huff, shifting her weight without opening her eyes. Outside, the sky deepened to a dusky violet. Inside, the air held the quiet contentment of something finished, not because it was over, but because it had finally become what it was always meant to be. No gallery walls, no critics. Just them.